Okay, so I think it's starting. My name is Julie Zuckerman. Welcome to the September Literary Modiin virtual author event. We have Evan Fallenberg, Janice Weizman, Joanna, Chen, and Yonatan Berg with us tonight, and I'll introduce each one of them in turn. But before we get started, just to say like 2 words about what is Literary Modiin. Basically a group on Facebook that I started about 1.5 years ago, and we've been having author events. Initially, these are all in-person events with bringing 3 authors at a time to Modiin. We have a very lovely art gallery here at the Sklar Levy Gallery. If you're in Modiin, go check it out. And my idea was to bring authors to the large English-speaking community in Modiin, where there are a lot of readers. And now, obviously, since we can't have in-person events or too many, we've gone virtual. And I know that so it's given us the opportunity to have authors from all over the place. Our last 2 events were solely authors from the States. We've come back to Israel, and this event with Evan, Janice, and Joanna was supposed to be in March, and we had to cancel or postpone it till now. So I'm very happy that we're finally doing this. Sorry, more people are in the waiting room. Let me admit all of them. Okay, I think they're all joining. And that's it. Each author will have about 15 minutes to speak, and then we'll open it up for questions. If you have any questions during their talks, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, we'll open it up afterwards for questions, and we will get started. Wait, 2 more people waiting to get in. Let me admit them. Okay. We are going to start with Janice Weizman, who's the author of the award-winning historical novel, The Wayward Moon. Her writing has appeared in World Literature Today, Haaretz, The Jerusalem Report, Lilith, and other places. Janice served for 10 years as the fiction editor for the Ilanot Review, and now curates the book review website, Reading Jewish Fiction, which I highly recommend. She teaches creative writing classes and workshops and mentors emerging writers. So, Janice, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Julie. I actually want to start by thanking you for this amazing literary platform that you've put together. Good for you. And I also want to say how happy I am to be sharing the virtual stage with Joanna and Evan and Yonatan. It's an honor. So I thought I would talk a little bit about my book, The Wayward Moon, which is a historical novel set in the 9th century Middle East. The protagonist of the book is a 17-year-old Jewish young woman by the name of Rachel. She's the daughter of a renowned physician. And I thought I would talk a little bit about the challenges of creating this character who actually lived supposedly 1,200 years ago, where there's a situation where there was very, very few historical sources to sort of understand the period with. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about creating that character. But first I want to talk a little bit about the book, just so you have an idea of what the book actually is. It opens in the town of Sura, which is where Rachel lives. And Sura was a center of Talmudic learning. And her father, at the very beginning of the book, is murdered by a crazed political rival. And then he comes after Rachel, and Rachel manages to escape him by murdering him. But then she knows she has to flee because the family will want to take revenge. So she disguises herself as a boy and sets off and goes on a journey through the Middle East. And it takes her from what is today Iraq, going through Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and ending in the Galilee. And it starts as a flight from her enemies, but eventually becomes a journey of self-discovery. So the idea for this book started years ago when I took a course called History of Islam. And it focused on the golden age of Islam. But one of the things that I found very dismaying about it was, though we read many, many texts, I found that there were virtually none written by women. And if there was a text where women appeared, it was usually only in connection to a man or in as much as that woman had something to do with an issue for the man. Other than that, like, you don't really hear women's voices at all. And it doesn't matter if it's a text from the Jewish tradition, Islamic tradition, Christian tradition. And it really bothered me because we know that the women were there and we know they were at least 50% of the population, but it's as if they were absent. And so when I was taking the course, I began to envision what it would be like for a woman of that time. And if someone was going to imagine their life, what her voice would sound like. I wrote the story, and after I did a first draft, I realized that there was a problem. And that was that I sort of had the wrong attitude towards her personality. I made her too adventurous, too feisty. I realized that rather than be sort of a Jane Eyre type character who is independent and looking for adventure and wants opportunity and wants to very self-possessed, she would actually have been the opposite. To be faced with a situation where she needs to take to the road after living her whole life in a small village, she would have been terrified. She would have been looking for somebody to tell her what to do at every stage. She would have no interest in testing herself or proving herself. She'd have no sense of pride in her accomplishments. It would be the opposite. It would all be very sort of scary and just something that she didn't have the resources to deal with. And so when I realized that, I was able to, I hope, write a character that was more authentic to the time. What I eventually realized is I had to keep in mind specific differences between our way of thinking today and then at the time. And I came to the conclusion there's basically three major things. The first was education, this idea that not only was she not educated, she would be totally illiterate, as were all the women at the time and many of the men. But it would be the sort of thing where when she does finally have the opportunity to learn to read and write, it feels very foreign, very strange. It's not like, oh, wonderful, now I can finally read. It wouldn't be that. It would be like, this is so, strange. This is weird. Why would I even need to know this? The second thing I thought about that would be a really major difference was the idea of movement and travel. It was like virtually, it just did not happen that a woman would, take to the road or go traveling anywhere on her own. If she went anywhere, it would only have been in the company of male relatives. So to find herself suddenly on her own, having to travel the roads, which it was very, very dangerous, and it was very strange. And she didn't have, again, the experience or the resources to even imagine how to do it. So I had to imagine her coming from that place. And the third aspect that I had to take into account was this idea of bodily autonomy. So of course, today, obviously women talk all the time about having autonomy over their own bodies and their own experiences. At the time, it would be exactly the opposite. Women had zero autonomy. They were told when to get married. They were told who to get married to. They had no control over how many children or when they'd have those children. It was kind of like they were just this vessel, and they didn't have a say. There's very little decision making about it. And that's just how it was. So I had to imagine a young woman who all of a sudden does have the opportunity to think about ways she wants to live, decisions she's going to make about herself, but with no training, with nobody to turn to, with no models, that kind of experience. And then I think once I sort of had a handle on those sort of things, it became a little bit easier for me to envision how she would see all these experiences that she was having. Okay, having said all that, I'm going to read a short passage from the book. It's right at the beginning. It's the murder scene, so a lot of action. And just as an introduction to the characters here, this is the scene where it begins where Rachel is preparing to meet her fiance, Asher Baraban. Abu Said is the murderer, the political rival who runs into the house and murders her father. Ben Shmuel is how her father is referred to here. And Shafika is the maid, the family maid. Okay. When Abu Said burst into our house, I was about to perfume my wrists with rose water. As I drew the delicate glass stick from the vial, it occurred to me that Asher Baraban might not like the smell of roses. Yad, our gardener, had told me that not everyone did. It was then, at that exact moment, that I heard a shout from the front room. I put down the vial and ran out into the hallway. My father stood in the entrance of our home, and not 10 paces from him, eyes flaming with the crazed gaze of a madman, was Abu Said. Although he was not a large man, the sight of him, panting and fuming with fury, was terrible. In his right hand, he held a dagger. "No believer will consent to this treachery," he cried. "Do you hear me, Ben Shmuel? You will renounce the appointment or suffer the consequences." "I will renounce nothing," I heard my father reply sharply. "The governor himself has personally requested that I take on the position." "We will not be ruled by a Jew because of one foolish heretic," he screamed. "I advise you to watch your tongue, Abu Said." "What's that, Ben Shmuel? You threaten me?" "If you know what's best, you'll turn around and leave this house at once." Perhaps if my father had not been a proud man, events would have unfolded differently. Perhaps if he had agreed to renounce the appointment, or even say that he would reconsider the matter, Abu Said would have been satisfied. On the other hand, it is possible that nothing would have appeased him, for he had brought his dagger and the notion of murder had taken root in his heart. "Honored sir," Shafika cried, falling at his feet, "please go home. Your father in his great wisdom will fix everything." But Shafika's words only fed his rage. "You," he roared, "you who are once a good Muslim woman, shame yourself by working in the home of a Jew. Don't you know your rightful place? Where is your self-respect? This man should be our servant." Somehow my father remained unmoved by Abu Said's hysteria. "This is your last chance," he warned. "Leave now and we'll both forget your childish outburst. Go home to your father. The Qadi will be very distressed if word of your behavior reaches his ears." "Allahu Akbar," he screamed out, and in a mad rage charged up to my father and plunged the dagger into his heart. Shafika let out a shrill wail. I ran to my father and fell to the floor where he lay crumpled and moaning, a bright red stain of blood spreading rapidly over his robe. "Run," he groaned. "Run to the study, close the door and move my desk to block it." "No," I screamed as I tried to lift his shoulders. "Don't close your eyes." But his eyes fluttered shut, and with his last remaining strength, he pulled me to him and whispered, "I'm dying, save yourself." I looked up and saw Abu Said's face, contorted with insane ecstasy, his hand still holding the dagger wet with blood. I jumped up, dashed to the study, shut the door, and flattened myself against the wall. Abu Said's steps were heavy. I heard the study door open and I slid behind it. "Where did you go, you little snake?" he muttered. "I saw you run in here. Do you think you can escape me now?" I was paralyzed beyond reason. It could only have been pure animal instinct that made my eyes dart around the room like a terrified animal until they fell on my father's desk where alongside the bowl of fruit lay the knife my father had used that morning. I reached out to grab it, but my trembling fingers pushed it to the floor where it landed with a low thud. Abu Said swung around, his face shining with madness. In the space of an instant, I swooped down lunging toward me. With a terrible howl, I raised my right hand and plunged the knife into his neck. Blood spilled from the wound onto his robe. I watched in horror as his fingers slowly released the knife, which fell to the floor and spun around in frenzied circles. Shafika ran into the room, screaming, while Abu Said gasped and writhed like a fish pulled from the river. He staggered forward several steps, then fell to the floor. It was a gruesome sight, and I too began to scream. Like a crazed choir, we screamed in unison, but while I felt myself to be on the very brink of madness, Shafika, by the grace of God, recovered herself. She held me in a tight embrace, as if she could see the powers of madness beckoning me to fall into abandon. "My daughter, you must run and hide," she whispered as she stroked my hair with shaking fingers. "When word of this gets out, Abu Said's family will surely avenge his death." Somehow, the steady tone of her voice calmed me enough to hear her words and know that all she was saying was true. It was only a matter of time until Abu Said's relatives came looking for me. Revenge would be demanded and taken long before I could plead my story to a judge. The only way for me to stay alive was to flee. Shafika ran out of the room and returned seconds later, holding items of my father's clothing. "You must dress in the clothes of a man." I glanced down and screamed again. My white dress was spattered with blood. The sight was so horrible that I could scarcely move. Shafika pulled my dress off, raised my arms, and wrapped an old headscarf of hers around my chest, flattening it like a boy's. She put my father's tunic over my head and his pants around my ankles and his rider's boots by my feet. Still stunned, I stepped out of my girl's slippers, put my arms and legs into the clothing and donned the boots. In the meantime, Shafika had found one of my father's turbans. She gathered up my hair, stuffed it into the turban, and fixed it tightly on my head. Stepping back as if to appraise her work, she shook her head and muttered, "God willing, you might just pass for a boy." I stared at her blankly, barely comprehending what was happening and what was about to happen. She grabbed the cloth bag that she used when she went to market, ran to the kitchen, and seconds later hung it across my flat chest. I remember how she embraced me, then put her strong, rough hands on my shoulders. "You must run, daughter. Run toward the date groves that grow along the road into town. I have no words of advice to give you. May God watch over you as he watched over the holy followers of the prophets in their flight from Mecca to Medina. I will tell Abu Said's men that you ran in the direction of the river, but remember, you run to the date groves. Allah protect you, child. With that, she pushed me out the door. That's it.
Wow, that was amazing. Afterwards, tomorrow, I'm gonna send around an email to everybody who's on this call, so you can all find out how to get a hold of all the books that you're going to hear about tonight. So thank you, Janice. And now we're going to go over to the duo of Joanna, Chen, and Yonatan Berg. Okay, Joanna's poetries, essay, and literary translations have been published in Guernica, Narratively, Mantis, and Consequence, among others. Her literary translations include Agi Michel's Less Like a Dove and Meir Shalev's My Wild Garden. She teaches literary translation at the Helicon School of Poetry and writes a column for the Los Angeles Review of Books. Tonight, she's going to be reading from Frayed Light, which is written by Yonatan, and which was a finalist for the National Book Award earlier this year. Yonatan Berg is a leading Hebrew poet. He is the youngest recipient of the Yehuda Amichai Prize and a number of other national awards. He has published 3 books of poetry, 1 memoir, and 2 novels. His latest book, Far from the Linden Trees, was published in 2018 and received excellent reviews. Yonatan Berg is a bibliotherapist. I love that, wow. And teaches creative writing in Jerusalem. So take it away, Joanna and Yonatan.
So good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces here tonight. And I just want to say thank you to Julie and thank you to Janice and Evan for being here too, and for your great books, both of which I've read. We're going to be reading tonight, Yonatan and I, from Frayed Light, published by Wesleyan. Yonatan's poems in my translation. The poems were chosen by both of us from 3 of Yonatan's books. So it really is a brand new book here, which just goes to show that translation is a wonderful act of creation. And also I have to say here that I'm not the only translator here tonight. Both Evan and Janice are also highly accomplished and published translators. So I thought it might be nice if Yonatan speak a little bit about the book and about his poetry, and then we'll read you a bit.
Hi everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. I will just say a few words of thanks to Joanna, and I would say it in a way that when you get your poems back in another language, you're in a way, you have another personality inside. You have another voice, another layer of voice on your voice. Because when I read the poems in English, and Joanna did a beautiful work, I thought the English is much more direct. It doesn't have the constant pressure of the shelves of book that Hebrew has. So in poems that I wanted to speak directly, and I wanted to speak simply, sometimes the Hebrew didn't let me. Because even if I speak to my mother, as the first poem we're gonna read, when I speak to her and I use Hebrew, and I want this intimate conversation with my mother, very personal one, very soft one, words jump from the page and they carry in, they can carry in something from the temple, they can carry in something from the Bible, they can carry in something from the Kabbalah. It doesn't matter. I didn't intentionally use those terms, but they jump out of the page. And when I get the poems back in English, when I get them from Joanna, I could hear, I would say, a clearer voice of myself. Because the language, for me anyway, which I don't have, maybe people here that English is their mother tongue will feel differently. But for me, which is a new language or a second language, I could hear a simpler voice in the poems. And sometimes that's what I meant to do. I wanted a simpler voice, but the Hebrew didn't let me, and Joanna let me. So I need to thank Joanna for making me simpler, which I always, it's a constant attempt in life. So the first poem we're gonna read, which is titled To My Mother, I wanna dedicate it to Geula, my wife, that is here on the screen also. You can see her. My mother gave me a home when I was a young boy, and now Geula gives me a home. So I think it's just a good fit to dedicate this poem to her. So I'm gonna read it in Hebrew, and then Joanna gonna follow up in English.
It's very important for me that Yonatan be here this evening and read in Hebrew, and I think that the English very naturally follows after. And what I attempted to do here was to have the reader still hear the original voice coming through in the English translation. So
and you did it. לאמי, את שואלת אותי בעינייך מניין הסתיו והפראות, מגישה לי מטפחת נקייה, תאנים בשלו. אני מתרחק כבר שנים ומוצא אותך לפני השינה, תוכבת את השמיכה בצידי גופי ושרה המלאך השומר על הנערים. איך להסביר לך את החיה המנהמת, אותו ורד הנעוץ בכל שעה, מחתים את האור באדום. חוטא בהרהורים אני יושב לצד העץ ורושם את תנועתו, את הזית המוציא סביבו כוכבים, את תנועת ידך המסמנת לי מרחוק בשביל. Oh, yeah.
We're going to show you the words now. Everybody see? Can you give me a thumbs up? Do you see?
Yeah, we can see them.
My mother. You ask with your eyes where autumn and savagery come from. You hand me a clean handkerchief, right here. I have been moving away for years, finding you before bedtime, tucking the blanket around me, singing of angels who watch over children. How can I explain to you the animal that growls within, the same rose hymn to every hour, staining the light red, singing in thought, me, sitting by the tree, sketching its movement, the olive releasing stars, one by one, the movement of your hands, signaling me from afar to come back.
So the second poem we're going to read is called Babylon, Babel, how we call it again? The voice of an immigrant. Right?
It's called Babel or Babel or
The immigrant speaks.
the immigrant.
Right. So I just want to share with you from which book it comes because it's important. It comes from a book called History, which is my third volume of poetry. I took the word history, the title it's a still from Robert Bly, History. And what I tried to do in that book is also, Robert Lowell, of course, not Robert Bly. And what I tried to do is something like Robert Lowell, which in some books tried in a way to summarize human history into poetry, poems about Caligula or Stalin or things like that. And I did the same with what I think of when I hear the word Judaism. So I published 2 volumes of poetry that were very personal, very biographical, childhood in settlement, living religion, service in the army, traveling in the world, and so on. And then I got to a dead end. I didn't want anymore to write about myself or my biographical experiences, and I didn't know where to go. And the path I found in the way that opened again the poetry for me was the attempt to summarize Judaism in poetry, which mainly means portrait poems of personalities, some poems about text, some poems about periods of time, but mainly personalities. So I go from the biblical heroes to the poets in Spain, and I goes all the way to Allen Ginsberg or Rothko or Golda Meir, and everything between, including Jesus, Shabtai Tzvi, and so on. So it's 120 poems, mainly about characters. And my attempt was to say, look at the colorful rainbow of Judaism and the way it changes and getting diverse and multiplying itself through time. So the poem we're going to read is a part of that attempt. And of course, it's not about a person. It's talking about the exile to Bavel. And I'm trying to speak through the persona of an immigrant from Jerusalem to Bavel. I'm not going to read it in Hebrew now, just Joanna is going to do the English.
And for me also, this poem, literary translation being in many ways an interpretation of the words and of the meaning. For me, this poem that I'm going to read to you now is also about how language both connects and separates us, and really reminded me of Cynthia Ozick, who said that translation can serve as a lens into the underground life of another culture. And I think that's what we're seeing here when we read this poem. So, do you want to?
Yeah.
Bavel, or Babel, the immigrant speaks. Nothing prepares you for being foreign. Nothing remains of home. The last vessels are shattered, the rules broken. Children no longer know the name. You want to place it, but it's always misplaced. The river and the animals hint there is someone to complain to, someone to tell of lost fragrances. Dissimulation, sweet talking, and lies, a new language. Nothing prepares you for death, far away from where you are. Suddenly you're living there, eating fruit under wraps by a reservoir, walking down a long path toward a well, falling asleep in grass. Nothing prepares you for the twilight. You revisit somewhere that does not exist, and all of a sudden, you're in the right place.
All right, the next one will be a complete turnover from what I just said a minute ago. It's a cold and hot water shower. So I'm taking you to maybe the most biographical moment, or to one of the most intense biographical moments in my life, and that's what the poem is going to be about. It's about an event that happened to me during service in the army in Hebron, the city. And we were serving there. I don't know if you remember, it's a pretty famous event. It was a Friday evening. We were protecting the settlers from Kiryat Arba going to Ma'arat HaMachpelah and back. And there was an attack of terrorists, and 12 soldiers and people of security services died, including the Machat, the chief officer of the area. I think some of us remember it. It's called, the name of the event is Simtat HaMitpalelim, the Alley of Worshippers is the name of the poem. But the poem is not about the battle itself. It's about the morning after, when I was supposed to go with another friend to take the bodies of the terrorists and to evacuate them. And I went there with an officer that was a good friend of mine. And when we reached there, and I was leaning to the bodies, I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. It was too much for me. So that's what the poem is about. And in a way, the last thing I want to say, in a way, many times when poetry deals with horrible occasions, with complicated occasions, she wants to be in touch with a small detail, or with an event that is in the side of the big event, of a specific person going through something in the midst of the chaos of war. And I think that's why I went to the morning after writing about it. I mean, the battle itself is so big, is so full of voices and noise and actions that I left it aside. You know, it's good for news. I went to something smaller, something more intimate, something more deep inside of me, and that's what the poem is about. So now Joanna's going to.
Julie said you can't hear me, so where's the mic?
You just
Yeah. Speak a little closer, I think, like Yonatan
Okay.
doing.
After a night in the valley of worshipers. And note that the title of the book was taken from this point. The point is not the frayed light of 6 a.m. or the barking of dogs half crazed by the scent of blood who we drove away, nor the fatigue from a night spent deep in death, the network that only now falls silent, the shouts from the platoon above, identifying bodies, the reflex that all this was to be expected. The point is not how they lay there after the dogs lunged into them, their faces distorted, their wounds festering, strewn together, black garbs, the dirt of the roads stained darker by their blood. One held the glimmer of a smile, not wicked or revengeful, just lost. The point is, I volunteered and Vish, the officer, was my friend. But when we got there, I could not. I simply could not. To this day, I see Vish and a soldier shoving them into the armored truck. They are dropped, are dragged. I don't have a better image for all this. The bodies dropped, dragged, over and over. And we're going to finish with a poem that Yonatan wrote many years ago, but I think it's a great poem for today. And it's called The End of Naivety, and it reminds me of what we're all going through today. The title here is Israel 2017, which is when I translated this poem, but it seems just as relevant today. The End of Naivety. Things were different. We did not sit in the presence of holy ones. Evening sauntered along the streets, and drunkenness reared up, startled, from the tavern of our hearts. The tree lost its mythical powers, horses huddled at the edge of the earth. The sniping light turned cold. Winter came. We continued, faces sealed. Only at night did we sit down with our own names. The yellow above our heads, the tone of air, the shape of time. Some of us tried talking to each other. Young guys hung around the square. Oppression smiled sadly. We laughed full-bellied, stretched out on couches, holding on tight to our increasing flesh. The rain began, our words were not heard. We stayed by the fire, lonely as love. We told ourselves it would pass. We put everything in place, near the couches, the armchairs, on the balcony, flowers spiraled toward the sun. We told ourselves those were the bad days, the high holy days. We cannot forever await our destinies. Some of us stood in the square. We sang songs in closed rooms. We wrote letters, beautiful ones with no address. We told each other, your eye is pure, blue as happiness. We lay together, meaning we bestowed love on each other. We added nothing, nor did we take away. There was no reason for them to know we had already left. Thank you very much. I think that's about enough, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Wow. Somebody posted a question, but we'll wait till the end for all the questions. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Evan Fallenberg. Evan is an award-winning novelist and translator. His most recent novel is The Parting Gift, and his earlier novels are Light Fell and When We Danced on Water. He teaches at Bar-Ilan University and Vermont College of Fine Arts, and he's the founder and artistic director of Arabesque, an arts and residency center in the old city of Akko. And for me personally, it's great to have Evan here because Evan was my teacher and a big part of the origin story of my book, gave me the prompt that started my book. So Evan, thank you and welcome, and take it away.
Thank you, Julie. And it's a pleasure for me to be here as part of this event. I came to your launching party at the gallery we were meant to be at this evening. So I feel like, you know, this really these days, this is the next best thing, and it's a good thing that it exists. There's a kind of an entree from the beautiful poems we heard and Janice's novel. I remember that the other day, I'm reading now Stefan Zweig's memoir, The World of Yesterday, and he had this to say about translation. For in this humble activity of transmitting the highest treasures of art, I experienced for the first time the assurance of doing something truly useful, a justification of my existence. And I love this on so many levels, but especially the level of, you know, when everybody thinks the humanities are you know, disappearing on us, that he could say this was, you know, he'd found his purpose in life through translation. Well, you know, I'm going to be preaching that for a long time, I think. I'm going to talk a little bit about one aspect of my most recent novel, The Parting Gift, which came out in 2018 in hardcover. And it was a really lovely design that won an award. And it, you know, you still read it like this, even though it's printed horizontally. And it came out just a few months ago in paperback with a new cover, which I like as well. And I am going to wade right into the difficult business of it because, first of all, the book came out after a highly unusual process of writing it. I spent about 18 months thinking about the book. I never wrote a word of it. I walked it. I took long walks and thought about the characters and thought about their story. And then I had an opportunity to do a writing residency in Vermont. And I had a month. And my plan was to get as much done of the novel as I could. And then whatever I couldn't finish in that time, I was going to make an outline for the rest of the novel. And what actually happened was I wrote the entire novel in 10 days. It's a short novel, but still, that's a strange accomplishment and a surprising one. And I remember at the time, you know, there were other novelists in residence at the Vermont Studio Center. And I was afraid to tell this to anyone because I knew everybody would hate me. I mean, what does that mean? You wrote your novel in 10 days. Obviously, when it came out, I defended myself by saying, well, you know, what have you been doing in the last 18 months? Have you, you know, written a story? Have you put, oh, yes, well, I did this, I did that. And I said, well, I guess, you know, I was basically writing this novel. I just wasn't putting any of it down on the page. And during those 10 days in Vermont, I had to keep reminding myself that if I censored any thought or emotion, then if I thought about what anyone would say or think, then the project would sink. And in residence at the same time were Peter Cole and Adina Hoffman. And Peter gave me Philip Roth's Sabbath's Theater. And I actually never finished the book, but I got the point. I knew why he gave it to me, and it helped me get over this block, this self-censorship block. And I thought if Philip could pave that route, then I'm going to take it. So what I wrote was a very daring book, a very sexy book. And I find myself often apologizing for it. So I return to the question all the time, why it had to be that way. Why did I have to write this particular book in this particular way? Or more broadly, why even write about sex? I mean, it's so dangerous to write about sex. You could accidentally write pornography, or you could write sex scenes that are bad enough to make yourself a candidate for the Bad Sex Writing Award. And if you want a real laugh, you can check that out. I mean, it's done every year by The Guardian, and it's the most awful sex scenes written by very good writers. You know, why even put yourself in there? And I think a lot of novelists actually stay away from writing about sex, you know, for a variety of reasons. But my first answer to that question is that as a writer, you have to know everything about your characters, everything, in order to make them as real as possible, to transmit that to your readers, and including what they do in bed and with whom. And even if you never show it, if you never have a sex scene, I believe that you really have to know what would happen in that sex scene that you're not going to write, because it's so intrinsic to who we are. But then, how do you choose when to include a sex scene and when to leave it out? When to do that lovely little space break, you know, where at one point they're drinking coffee at the kitchen table or sitting in a bar, and then suddenly the next moment they're, you know, climbing out of tangled sheets, like we've seen in so many movies. It's the same equivalent, the equivalent. But why would you choose actually to show what goes on in that white space? So I think it's really because when the sex scene actually has other meanings and resonances, whether it's giving you characterization, or it shows something about the true nature of relations between characters, or it gives you plot development or something about theme. So on the book tour that I did for this book, I spoke at the Lighthouse in Denver, which is a fabulous literary venue in Colorado. And I had an audience of 50 writers, and they wanted me to talk about writing sex scenes in literary fiction. And so en route to Denver, I sat on the plane and I was preparing the session. And what I discovered was that although if somebody had asked me how many sex scenes there are in The Parting Gift, I would have said 6 or 7. And I discovered that there were, in fact, only 2. And so it turns out that while a book is in a way saturated with sex, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, I only found it necessary to go graphic about it twice. And then what I was doing in those scenes was showing aspects of intimacy and power struggles and Arab-Jewish relations and male entitlement. So even though I'm a little sheepish sometimes and kind of apologetic about it, I stand behind what I undertook in the Parting Book, in the Parting Gift. So, and oddly, I have to admit that the book I'm working on now has no sex in it. Maybe it'll pop up at some time. Sorry, no, that wasn't intended. But I think from what I know about the story that I'm writing, there's no place for it. And it's while I could talk to you and to myself about the sex lives of the characters that I'm writing, this time I think it's not necessary to show them. Before I read a little section of The Parting Gift, and don't worry, I'm not going to read a sex scene, I just wanted to mention that I'm working on the film script of The Parting Gift right now with a very talented Singaporean filmmaker. And part of the planning we did over 3 weeks in London together in February, when things like that were still possible, was figuring out just how sexy or not we want the film to be. And it's a really fascinating process to go about it all over again, in a way, only for a new medium. And also what I've discovered about writing a film script is it is a new work of art. So in a sense, the questions have to be asked again. What is this book/film about? What needs to be shown, what can be left out? And the focus, of course, is changing in certain ways, and obviously certain things are staying. As I mentioned, I'm not going to read a sex scene, but I'm going to read a scene that leads up to the first of the 2 sex scenes. Just a word about throwing you into this at this point. The Parting Gift is an epistolary novel. It's one long letter written by the unnamed narrator to Adam, whose house he has just left after 4 months on his couch. And in this scene, the narrator and his friends have stopped off at a seaside spice nursery they've read about. We had been there for nearly an hour when I went looking for someone to pay for all the goodies we'd gathered. The only soul I met was the dog Danny had been petting, a caramel-colored, short-haired breed with a pointy nose like the kind you see on the tombs of the pharaohs. It was quiet and no one was about. I wandered around in the messy yard and finally entered a little building that clearly wasn't one of the houses on the property. I could see someone toward the far wall, his back to me and crouching, so that only the baseball cap on his head was showing. I made my way toward him, past shelves crammed full with boxes and appliances and light fixtures and I don't even know what, just rows and rows of stuff that wouldn't pass muster at a yard sale. What I saw when I reached him was the upended lawnmower he was working on and his naked, slightly hairy back. The black waistband of his underwear rose above the belt on his olive green work pants, which sported a few tools and a telephone pouch that seemed to be empty. "We want to pay," I said in my blunt, unripened Hebrew. "Okay," he told me, not looking up from the lawnmower. "In a minute." I was already accustomed to a sales style unlike here in the States, where salespeople pretend they're your best friend and sometimes tell you their whole pathetic life story when all you want is to buy a pair of jeans. Over there in Israel, they act more like they couldn't give a fuck if you buy or not. I looked around again at the mess and was about to go back to my friends when he spoke up. "It was the carburetor," he said. "One of my idiot employees used old gasoline from a rusty can." He popped a few screws into place, wiped his hands on an oil-black towel lying next to him, and stood up, his back still to me. I could see that he was a few inches shorter than I, but still a good 6 feet tall and very broad. He grabbed a t-shirt, and as he turned to face me, he took off his hat and mopped the top of his bald head. The hair under his arm was light, almost blonde, and I could smell him. Oh yes, I could definitely smell him. And everything that eventually happened may have started at that particular moment, with the scent of him rolling off in waves and wafting under my untested nose. "I've smelled you too, Adam. Your true, real scent under that cloying body spray you used to cover up any connection to the real physical world. But yours is different. It has no body, no weight to it. Your smell is thin, gaseous, almost like legumes cooking on a stovetop. This man standing in front of me, though, his smell was meaty, truly pungent and ripe. I was drawing it in through my nostrils and holding it there, letting it shoot straight into my limbic system, that ancient part of the brain where memory and emotion and lust and smell get entangled. He was facing me now, still mopping himself, but lower, his chest and armpits. I stood watching. His chest and belly were thick with honey-colored curly hair, his nipples large and erect. He was going about his business with no mind to me, while I was going about his business with no mind to myself. I didn't know then what it was I found so riveting, but I clearly couldn't stop watching him touch himself. When he was done, he tossed the shirt over his head and his naked chest disappeared behind a faded green t-shirt with a logo I couldn't read. "What did you want to buy?" he asked me. My friends, they're outside," I said, slightly breathless, pointing over my shoulder. He brushed past me to lead the way out, his hand on my back to turn me to the right direction. I followed him out of the large shed, back to the yard, and into the coop with the spices, where Maya, Ariella, and Danny were chatting over the wire baskets, and the dog was standing at attention. "Are you Uzi?" Ariella asked him as he walked behind the counter, where there was a computer and a cash register I hadn't noticed before. "Yeah, Uzi the spice guy," Maya added, almost to herself. He looked at her but said nothing. My friends handed over the baskets and he weighed and punched in numbers until eventually he came up with a grand total that could have been a completely bogus number, but I suspected was not. He dumped everything into plastic bags with the same logo as his t-shirt and handed them over. Maya and Danny and Ariella took out their wallets and paid in cash. "This is a really great place," Maya said to Uzi. "We read about you in Haaretz." He nodded. He may have smiled, but it was hard to tell under the sandy beard and mustache that covered the lower half of his face. I stood watching all of them. My friends from Tel Aviv, this man, the spice guy, Uzi. I said nothing. I did not move. I wasn't even thinking, though I believe now that the powerful smell from his body may have been trapped in my nostrils and affecting my brain. Maya and Ariella and Danny pocketed their change. Danny lifted 2 of the bags. Maya and Ariella one each of the others. They said goodbye, thanked Uzi, started heading for the front of the coop. Uzi was busy with the cash register. He'd pressed a button and the day's transactions were scrolling forth. "Yoo-hoo," Maya called back to me from the vegetable section. "What'd you forget?" I stood there immobile. "I'm staying," I called back. Ariella and Danny stopped at the entrance. Uzi looked up from the register as if noticing me for the first time. I looked him straight in the eye and said it again, softer this time, to him only. "I'm staying." Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. I'll just make another note that my book club here in Modiin, we read The Parting Gift last year, and Evan came and spoke to us, and we had a great discussion. So anybody out there who's in a book club, I can recommend it for your book club. There were a couple questions that popped up in the chat, so I'm going to go to those first, and then if people want to unmute themselves and ask a question directly, that would be great. So Vicky asked to all the translators out there, which I guess all three of you, is it harder to translate poetry than prose?
Yes, that's why I don't do it. I think you have to be a poet. You have to be a poet to be able to translate poetry. I got stuck with translating a poem by Natan Altoman once because it was in a book of Meir Shalev's that I was translating, and I couldn't find a published translation. But I knew I was having a rough time of it, and I was willing to pay good money to a translator to do the poem for me. But in the end, I did it myself.
Yeah, I also got stuck with Meir Shalev's book, translating a lot of poetry that I couldn't find or they didn't like. But I just want to say that I personally prefer translating poetry. Poetry gives me that tingly feeling when I read good poetry, and I want to do it. I can already hear the English coming through as I read when it's good poetry or poetry that I love. And I always tell my students, if you read a poem and you don't love it, then let it go. Perhaps that's true about people as well, but very true about poetry. If you don't love it, then don't do it, because poetry, translating poetry, is something that you take into your heart and your soul, and you walk around with it, and you think about it, and you breathe it, and it becomes a part of you. I think also structurally, poetry gives you more kind of wiggle room, if only because you have these short lines, and you have the line breaks, and you can make new line breaks, and new meanings can come out of that. So I think that the structure of poetry also lends itself more easily to being creative, and I think that literary translation is a very creative process to go through.
Okay. Erica Dreyfus, who's a poet on the line with us and appeared at one of our earlier Literary Modiin events, wrote this in the chat. Thank you about the such truth behind Zweig on translation. She's grateful to all the translators who make it possible for her to read Hebrew literature in English. She'd be interested to know from Evan how long you worked to revise the novel. It took you 10 days to write. And I have a follow-up question to that, which I'll just say, which is your current book that you're working on. Are you also still walking around with it in your head and you're planning to write it in 10 days or a month, or have you been writing it slowly? So take care of this.
Right. So the revision process, this is the book of my 3 published novels that went through the least amount of revision, I'd say. It stayed closest to the original text. And I think there was something special about those 10 days that were so intense and so special that gave me something really, really precious and solid to work with. But I'm very lucky in my publisher, the publisher, Other Press, Judith Gurevich, who has a very unusual system she uses with some of her authors, in which she sits and reads the entire book aloud with them privately at her home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we sat for 3 days and read the book together aloud. And I'd say it gave me 2 things. One, a really wonderful person to be there working with me on what needed to be changed, but it also at the same time made me more convinced about what to keep, what not to change. And there were a few times that she's a very powerful presence. And I can recall one particular instance where not only was she advocating for a certain change, but she'd given the book to a French editor, a very prominent French editor who was considering it for his publishing house in Paris. And they were both arguing for the same point. They wanted to change something. And I remember, the pressure was pretty intense there, and something was bothering me about it. And I remember standing up in her living room and pacing. And as I started to pace, I started to talk about what was bothering me about their suggestion. Eventually, I got to the point, I got really worked up about it. And Judith clapped her hands and said, "Oh, I love being proven wrong. You're absolutely right." And whatever it was, I got to keep that point. So it was. I feel like the whole process of writing the book and revising the book was so different from anything I've done, and I didn't expect that the process of writing this book, the new one, would be anything like that. And it's absolutely different. I've taken a book that I actually wrote between my second and third novels. It wasn't right, but I never put it away entirely because I knew I would come back to it. And I'm recreating it as an entirely different book. I'm completely rewriting it, and it's in 3 very frightening to me sections, and I'm thinking about them all the time, and I am writing them. And I've just discovered something new today, which is that I will never be able to complete one section without working on the others. So it's going to be this juggling act with the 3 of them until I finally somehow bring them all to fruition, and don't ask me how or when that's going to be.
Great. Okay, so this is a question from Guula for Evan and Janice. Okay, can you talk about the process of research for your novel, especially as you have characters, and this is a question I was going to ask also, who are, you have several significant Arab characters in your book, Evan, and Janice, we heard about the Muslim characters in your book. How is the process for you of research and getting into the heads of characters who have very different backgrounds than you come from?
Okay, I'll talk. I'll give Evan a little rest. So it was a very demanding book to research, you can imagine. I did start from the course that I did, History of Islam, and I had exposure to a lot of sources, and I continued from there. But what I do like to talk about, which is maybe more sort of different and interesting in terms of the research, is not just books or internet, but living here in Israel, there's so much of the culture that you could sort of envision in this place, but a millennium ago. For example, you have the geography, there's a lot of archaeological sites, markets, churches, mosques, old cities, various old cities. I would look at literature, I would look at music, even like the themes in Middle Eastern music, I think are something that hasn't changed that much, love and thwarted desire and that kind of thing. I looked at cookbooks a lot, I looked at cooking, because there's scenes in the book where Rachel becomes a cook in an inn. So, I really got into the idea of what kind of food she'd be making. Agriculture. I even at one point I was looking at Persian paintings just to see how people are seated, who's beside who, what they're wearing, what objects are in the room, sort of anything I could kind of grab onto that would make it feel more authentic. So it's very much sort of rooted in my experience in the Middle East. And I traveled a little bit to Turkey, to Morocco, to Egypt, so that also came into play. And what's really great about it is that nobody can really say I'm wrong, except for very specific things, because obviously it's not like writing a World War II novel where somebody will say, wait a minute, that wasn't how it was at all. Nobody's going to come back. So maybe that gives you a bit of
I think you have to think before you take on a project like that. And I'm not sure everybody is always aware when they start something like that. I mean, what an undertaking it is. I was thinking it when you were reading as she was, the whole thing starts when she's about to daub herself with perfume, and you describe the little vial with the stick, the fragile perfume stick, and I thought, wow, every little detail you have to make sure. Were there perfume sticks? Were there vials? On and on and on and on. I'd be terrified by that. I think I've only written well, contemporary, except for my second novel starts in 1922. So I did have to go back, and that book actually demanded more research for me. That was When We Danced on Water. And like you, Janice, I made a trip. Mine was from Warsaw to Gdansk to Copenhagen to Berlin. I was tracing the route of the main character, and that was a crazy project. I consulted an astrologist about my character because I gave him the birth date February 22nd, 1922. I wound up taking 2 years of ballet lessons to understand what went on in his head as he was, holding his body. I didn't need 2 years of ballet lessons. I got carried away. And that's also a danger. We're giving a lot of caveats to the would-be, the person who wants to write the story of the ballet dancer in the 15th century. Well, guess what? You're going to have a lot of research to do. So be careful what you take on. But it's also a lot of fun because I know that I take on what I want to take on. That's also the beauty of a novel. So I wanted to learn more about the dance world. With this present book, somebody just said to me the other day, wow, I can't believe you're not a master chef. There's so much food in all of your books. And I'm not a very good cook at all. But I definitely like to eat. And it's also fun doing that kind of research about what people are eating and what grows where. And so I'm careful to contain in my books the subjects that I would like to know more about, rather than the ones that are, I know I will never write a character with an electrical engineer because I have no capacity for understanding what he or she does ever. It's too much for me. So, there's a way of holding and shaping what we do and what we want to do. I think that the famous idea of write what you know, I don't believe in that. Write what you want to know. That's my motto for writing.
Definitely, I agree. Although a follow-on question, Evan, for you, because in the parting gift, you have a couple of major characters that are Arab. Did you have to have any sensitivity readers for that, or did you feel like it's something I'm struggling with right now, the current book I'm working on, that unfortunately I don't really come in contact with any Arabs beyond, superficial interactions in the supermarket and the pharmacy and places like that. So how did you go about making sure that your characters were authentic?
So first of all, a little correction, because I think Yeula wrote in and said something about that I wrote from the first person voice of an Arab male. That's not true. He is one of the characters, but the narrator of the book is an American Jew, something I know a little something about. The Arab characters, well, I live now in an Arab town in the old city of Akko. All of my neighbors are Arabs. And yet I wouldn't claim that I can just climb in the head of any person in my neighborhood and sound like them. But this comes to the big, huge issue these days of appropriation and what stories we're allowed to write and whose voices we're allowed to write. And of course, I say of course, as a novelist, if we can't use, and I don't mean exploit, but I mean use in a good sense, other voices, people who are not us, then I can't imagine what novels would look like. I don't want to write novels about Evan Fallenberg, a whole bunch of characters that are Evan Fallenberg. And as soon as you have two characters in a novel, how can you have two of the same characters? So my baseline is, of course you have to be allowed to write different characters. The question is, with how much sensitivity, knowledge, experience, research do you do them? And with what agenda? And this is something that's very, very tricky. And this is what I think you can get called out on. I would hope, I did not give my book to any of my Arab friends to read beforehand to tell me whether, I'd gotten the Arabs right. I trusted myself, and I haven't had criticism about that. But now I'm inviting it, I suppose, by saying something like that. But I really, really very strongly believe that we have to be able to continue to write a multitude of characters with sensitivity.
Agreed. Yeah, I think it's all in the, as long as you can make the characters feel authentic, then should be okay about being able to write other, characters who are not, from our own background. But
can I just say a second? I wanted to say thanks, Evan, for such a great answer. Sorry. Okay.
Why is that happening? Thank you, Geula. Oh, I definitely wanted to hear more.
Okay, there's a question from Abigail Kaplan, who's joining us from Manchester, England. Welcome, Abigail. And she's asked, do you all write longhand or on a computer or another digital format?
I write poetry longhand. I write essays on my computer, and translations only on the computer. Otherwise, I don't know, forget what I'm doing, and I keep track of it, of all the changes that I made. Poetry translations, I also sometimes do them, write them longhand. I have a book I carry around with me, and sometimes a word will pop up that I was looking for, and then I'll write it down there in the book. Yep.
Well, I would say only computer. I can't imagine any other way. If I had to write by hand, I don't know if I could write a book.
Yeah, me too.
I actually, the current novel draft that I'm working on, I wrote it all by longhand first, because I felt like if I wrote it on the computer, I would just be revising the first paragraph like 1,000 times, and I wouldn't get past that first paragraph. And it's also something I've done to get myself unstuck, especially in the pandemic, since the pandemic. If I've been working on a story and then I feel stuck, then I move to longhand, and it just, I don't know if what I'm writing in the longhand is any good or if it's complete crap, but at least it gets the words flowing. So I don't know.
I hope you have good handwriting and that you can read it afterwards.
You can see where I was starting to even fall asleep in my own writing, the handwriting was going off. Does anybody else have other questions? You can unmute yourselves if you want.
Question?
I want to say about that. Oh, go ahead, Randy.
Okay, Evan, actually it's for you and for Joanne. Evan, you had said that, if you want to know everything about your character, when you're talking about what they do in bed, whether you use it or not, it's just important to know about it. And I was wondering, from a translator point of view, do you feel that knowing more than what's in the book about the characters helps you to choose and understand them when you're translating them? I find this especially difficult when I was translating writers who have passed away and I couldn't call them up. So I wanted to know about them, and it's a thing that I've been thinking about. And I wondered, Joanne, too, you said it's very creative in the writing the poetry. It's freer, that you have choices in the process. It's a creative process. And I wondered if also with Yonatan, did you ask him and know more than what was actually in the poem, but it gave you something to work with when you did look for the words? So as a translator, do you want to know more about the characters also? Does it help?
So first of all, you know what they say, dead poets don't argue with you, so I'm
planning on keeping no lag.
Keep arguing.
So I'll just precede my response by saying that I think that researching is a very important part of the translation process. No, it's not enough what is written in the piece of prose or poetry. You have to go look stuff up. I'm now translating Masha Glosman's Dragon Fodder, La Theatre de Racon, and in which the main character time travels to the Crusader period in Atlit. So it's almost like going and dressing up for the part. I've done extensive research on, well, how did they speak during those days and what did they wear? And I found myself looking for costumes of knights and maidens. And you can get yourself a pretty good costume of a knight for about $120. I can tell you where afterwards if anybody's interested. So it's very important. And the translator, I think, does have to spend time with herself, finding these things out. I never sat with Yonatan for half an hour over each poem so he could explain it to me, because I want my little brain to work on its own and work things out. But then afterwards we sat and we talked extensively and sometimes argued in the National Library in Jerusalem over interpretations of certain words.
Of his poem, interpretations of his poem, of his poem,
right, of his poem. And we didn't always agree, did we?
Yeah, but in the end, I always surrendered to Joanna. And it's too risky. She wants me dead, as we saw. In the end, I always said, yeah, we go with your version of things. No, but I just want to say one word. We're speaking so much about the translations. I want to say from the other side that usually when you publish a book, there is this sadness of letting him go. And usually you have this grief of, and you don't come back to it. It's like almost a dead thing for you. You know, you go on with your next books, and it's even hard sometimes to go back to your books, because why? I mean, it seems a little bit narcissistic sometimes, you know, to sit and read your poetry. But then you have the opportunity of the translator, and you meet your poetry again, you know, poems that I wrote 8-10 years ago. Joanna brought me back into them. So in this process, I could meet myself back, you know, as a young man, or a few years ago, or what I feel in the present, and I could wear again the clothes of the poem that I didn't do for a very long time. So what I'm trying to say is that because everyone are translators, I'm saying thank you in the name of all the books and poems you're going to translate, or you did translate, for the reliving of our creation through you. Yeah, that's it.
And I just want to say here that Rachel Neve-Midbar, who was with us 1 second ago, but now I don't see her, she is the one who got us both together at the beginning. So thank you. You did good.
She's here. She's here.
I would add that I really love working with writers on translations because I like that insight. I like to really know, and I know that my translation will be better because I have spoken to the writer and gotten his or her take, and I can understand what was behind those words so much better. So for me, it's really priceless. And one of the rare times I was working on a dead writer's work was 5 plays that I translated with Jessica Cohen by Hanoch Levine. And of course, with Hanoch, I mean, there was so much I still want to talk about with him 20 years after his death. But in that case, I had Jessica. And so the two of us were talking constantly about what he really meant. And then we consulted with his widow and with his editor and with his producer and with his musicians. And we had this whole cadre of people we could talk to. And I really feel like it was so much richer. The whole process was so much richer because we had all of those people to interpret things with. We also watched videos where we could get them when we finished our work. And sometimes the actors, we chose some productions that had been staged by Hanoch. And sometimes the actors would say the line in a way that we would look at each other and say, that we both got it wrong here. We need to rethink the translation of that particular line because of the way they spoke it. So it was, it's, as you know, Randy, it's an endlessly fascinating and sometimes frustrating process.
Thanks.
Thank you. Does anybody have any other questions? Okay, so then I'm gonna wrap up. I want to thank all of our authors and for everybody who joined us tonight. It was a great crowd, great questions, everyone. Looking forward to sharing with you when our next event will be. And I'll be sending out an email, as I said, with more information on how you can get all these wonderful books if you don't already have them. So thank you, everyone, and have a good day or a good night, depending on where you are.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye, thanks.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.